All right. Well, good evening. Welcome to the conversation about the Turners at Tubor Historic Events. Getting ready, another live stream and more historic information talking about the German American experience before the Civil War as we get ready to portray members of the Ninth Ohio. I'm Will Eichler from Tubor Historic Events, and I have Dan Woolert and Andrew Hufftailing with me. Gents, I'm going to let each of you go ahead and introduce yourselves as we get up and going. I see we already have 4 people with us this evening. So, Dan, you're the new guy. Let's go ahead and let you take it and start with you. Tell them a little bit about who you are and what your link to history is here.
Sure. My name is Dan Wellert. Live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a local historian here. I've been focusing on sort of regional food history, but the reason that I'm on tonight is that I wrote a book called Cincinnati Turner Societies, an American Movement, and hope to fill everybody in that's interested in the Ohio knife on the influence of the Cincinnati Turners, who were the first Turner Society in America, and the Turner movement in general here in the United States. So very happy to be here tonight and look forward to our discussion.
Great. Well, I see more people showing up and more people checking in on the chat. Stop in, say hi, gang. We're all kept away from each other. Don't be afraid to have some conversations down in the chat. Matter of fact, Dan, I've got a couple of links ready to go over there. Why don't you've written a book and we got the picture up there of it a moment or two ago. Talk to me about a couple of blogs that you work on as well.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the food history, I've written a couple of books, but I also have a food blog called Dan Wellert, the Food Etymologist. And I've done a couple of blogs that we've got links to related to the Ohio knife and the Civil War. And one of those is about the sutler to the unit, who was Frank Link, who before the Civil War had a brewery with his brother. And they were involved in some events that we'll talk about. And recently, a local brewery here in town scraped one of their basement brewing vessels and made a beer from about 100, what we think is over 150-year-old yeast. And that yeast is now a Cincinnati asset. And so people can get that yeast and make beer from what we think is a pre-Civil War yeast, reactivated yeast. So that's a cool blog. I also have another blog where I talk about a cracker bakery here in Cincinnati that supplied hardtack to the American Army during the Civil War. And so in the legacy of what were called cracker bakers, many of whom conglomerated and are now part of the Keebler organization. So from hardtack to Keebler Cheez-Its, right
Wow.
here in Cincinnati.
Well, the shape's about the same, and it just the side thought is if you've gotten the free video from Civil War Digital Digest on how to make these, and we talked in it about some of the research Mike Schaffner did on the commercial baking ovens and the commercial baking process. Here's a chance to see some of the behind the scenes. So take a chance and check out Dan's blog there. Let's turn to our buddy Andrew Hufftailing, who's helping put this together. Andrew, give it to you for a little bit of an introduction.
Sure. My name's Andrew Hufftailing. You guys have probably all seen me before. I'm the director of the Ninth Ohio Living History. We just are an organization that are attempting to educate the public on the importance of the German American element during the Civil War. We're a member of the German American Citizens League here in Cincinnati, and that organization has a similar goal and is an umbrella organization for, I believe our latest count was 47 different German American groups around the Cincinnati area.
Wonderful. Well, gang, welcome. That's about 5 minutes of preamble. Let's get into the story. Join us, pull up. I know Andrew's got a pint going. I'm on the post-Christmas pullback, and so I got a nice pint of water. Whatever you have, pull up, sit down, and let's get the conversation going. The conversation tonight is about a group of people called the Turners. Okay? Let's just start there. Dan, if you want to pick up us and get us into this, who are the Turners, and let's start finding them so we can find their relation to the Ninth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Turner movement and I call it a movement because it really is a movement, started in Germany during the Napoleonic Wars in 1811. It started by a gentleman by the name of Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, and it was founded in 1811, a little bit north of Berlin, Germany, so northern Germany, and it was founded to help kind of school young men into being physically fit, ready for for war, ready to expel the French, and to kind of have an open mind. And so that was really the start of the movement. They came to America through the 48ers, which you talked about, I think, in a previous episode with Willig. And so those 48ers brought that mentality here to the States. The first unit the first Turner Society was founded here in Cincinnati in November of 1848. So just kind of starting from a broad base, the German verb turnen was a word that Friedrich Ludwig Jahn kind of invented, and it means to do gymnastics or to exercise. And the Turners developed a very specific type of exercise that was kind of before, way before contemporary exercising, kind of like a CrossFit mentality, if you want to liken it to something today. Friedrich Ludwig Jahn invented some of the things that we know of in gymnastics today, like the pommel horse, the parallel bars, the hanging rings. And so basically everything that kind of led into track and field events and even the Olympics are based on the Turner philosophy. So kind of breaking down into that, there's a great quote about the Cincinnati Turners that also talks to what they were in addition to kind of, an exercise group. There's a quote that says, "The Turners were responsible for melting the early cultural frigidity of Cincinnati." And I love that quote because think of, about that time, the culture was kind of Anglican or English based, and they didn't drink on Sunday. They had very strict religious views. Then you have these German immigrants that come in the 1830s and 1840s, and they love beer hall culture. They love a good parade. They love a good beer or wine infused picnic. They love to dance. They have songs. They sing. They play music. They, they're artists. They just have this great, cultural aspect that they bring to them. And so, in addition to being sort of gymnasts, the Turners also wanted to preserve their German culture because they were very proud of it. They were proud of their beer, their wine, their dance, their, all their folk culture. And so they brought that with them. So they had a motto that was frisch, frei, stark und treu. And that's, each of those kind of has its own meaning, but it basically means a sound mind and a sound body. They promoted healthy debate. They promoted having an open mind without superstition. And they really were sort of the free thinkers of America and influenced a lot of early American political sort of institutions that came about as the progressive era. So I would say, and I say that they're one of the most influential immigrant groups in America and one of the most patriotic. And we'll talk about that, obviously, with their involvement in the Civil War. So that kind of gives you a beginning perspective of what kind of group they were. There are still Turners Turner societies in existence today. They're not as big and certainly not as Germanic as they were back in the day. We can thank anti-nativism of World War I and World War II for that. But they're really starting to pick up again in terms of accepting their reaccepting or reclaiming their Germanness or their Germanic pride in history and that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew, let's give it over to you for a little bit. Let you pick up and keep running with the German ball, as it were.
Sure. So, Dan mentioned the 48 revolutions, and we had talked about that a little before. And it's kind of important to emphasize that one of the differences between the Turner movement in the German states and in the United States, over there, it was Dan might be able to give the exact dates, but Turner clubs were banned in many of the German states following or leading up to the 48 revolutions. And I believe 1840 was when they were first allowed back again. And sure enough, only 8 years later, there's a revolution. And so the participation on the part of the Turners in the 48 revolutions, it was sort of disjointed, a lot like a lot of the 48 groups that were part of that movement. And part of that reason behind that is because the government was spying on these groups, and they were suppressing free speech. And so, as Dan mentioned, when the movement came to the United States, it was a ripe ground to grow. There were, though, some Turners that were involved. One of the Turner companies that fought on the side of the revolution was the Hanauer Turnverein, and some of the names that we see are some of the same names that we spoke about in the Willich live stream, or if anybody caught the interview that I had with Christian Wolff about the 48 revolutions. And so we have people like Gustav Stube, Franz Siegel, both of them were Turners, and Friedrich Hecker, who also was a Turner. He was also involved heavily in sort of the setting up of the American Turner movement. So after the revolution, the seeds of the movement are really, as Dan mentioned, sown in Cincinnati. And so some of the names that we associate with the founding of the Cincinnati Turngemeinde is, first of all, the Toffel family. That was a large family. I believe there were 8 of them, but there were 5 brothers who were involved in the founding of the first Turner Society in the United States. They along with, I believe it was a total of 14 of them, met in I'm picturing just sort of a dark room on the second floor of a guy named, was it Fettweiss where they met, Dan?
No, it was Kienzl. Well, they met in 2 places. The first one was Karl Rebstock's saloon in Over the Rhine. And then when Friedrich Hecker came to town in October of 1848 via Switzerland after losing in one of the battles in the 1848 revolution, then they met him at a tavern that was owned by Kienzl that was renamed the Hecker House in his honor. And they had he kind of wanted to be on the down low. And of course, as soon as the word got out that Hecker, that he was in town, all the Germans wanted to throw him a torch parade and, have a party. And so they renamed this tavern the Hecker House. And that's where they talked to him about forming the Turner Society. And what's interesting is that Hecker was kind of, after meeting with these Turners in Cincinnati, he decides, well, this is going to be the most coherent organization in America that I can use as a fundraiser to go back in 1849 and refight the revolution, which, as we know, was unsuccessful. By the time he got to Strasbourg, they had already lost that second battle. But what it did for us was it founded all of our Turner societies. So after he left Cincinnati in November, after the Cincinnati Turnverein was founded, he went to St. Louis, Missouri. He went to New York City and helped to found the New York City Turnverein. He then went to Philadelphia, where they founded the Philadelphia Turnverein. And so, this Turner movement just kept spreading throughout German settlements within America at the time. So by 1851, there were 22 Turner societies in the U.S. By 1853, it had more than doubled to 70. And then by the start of the Civil War in 1861, there were 157 Turner societies with about 10,000 members.
Well,
So
Dan, Dan, I'll cut in there for just a second and say thank you
Sure.
because Stephen Pavey asked exactly that question in the chat. At its height, how many individuals? So we think about 10,000 individuals at its height as a movement in the United States?
That's not even the height. The height was in the 1880s, and there were hundreds of thousands by then, because after the Civil War, they went into this formation mode, and not only the big cities like Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville, but even the small little suburbs. And the same thing happened in Cincinnati. There was one Turner Society downtown and over the Rhine, but as the Germans moved out to the burbs, all these German enclaves in the outside of downtown formed their own neighborhood Turner societies, and they formed what was called the Turner Bund. And there was a national president, and they met, on a kind of like a quarterly basis to talk about what do we do as Turners, and what are our issues, and what do we do to lobby these issues within the U.S. government.
Okay, is this an organization level that they have before the Civil War, or is this after?
Yes, they did. So by the 1850s, they had a Turner Bund. They had a national Turner president. By 1853, they had started what they called Turnfests, which is where all the Turner societies would meet in a city, and they'd have like Olympic Games and compete in sports events. And so definitely by the Civil War, they had this network set up. They had the Turner Bund. It's probably one of the most organized institutions in America at that time for immigrants, certainly for German immigrants. And so what benefit this was to a newly arriving Germanic immigrant was that they could get a Turner membership card, say in Cincinnati, and if they wanted to move to St. Louis, to New York City, to Philadelphia, all they had to do was show up at the Turner Hall in that city with that membership card, and they were almost guaranteed a job, or certainly guaranteed entry into the local German American community. And so that's why all these Turner units in the Civil War were so connected, because they knew each other through the Turner Bund. They had this communication amongst themselves.
Fantastic. Well, before we move forward, Andrew, I know you've got a few more, and I've got some questions here. Andy, Eric, I'll hold those questions for a little bit. Andrew, there's some names and some people you want to talk about in relation to the movement starting in Cincinnati that will relate not only to the 9th Ohio, but to our company. So if you want to introduce us to some of these movers in the Turners that we'll see in summer of 1861, why don't you do that right now?
Sure. So, I mentioned the Toffel family, and there were two Toffel brothers who were in the 9th Ohio. They were actually in First Company. Gustav Toffel, he is a name that not only everybody in the 9th Ohio would know, but basically anybody, any German American within the city of Cincinnati or its surrounding area, and definitely any Turner on the national level would have heard of Gustav Toffel and know who he was. He was the first Turner president in the United States. He was the president of the first president of the Cincinnati Turngemeinde. And he was born in Munich, but essentially he was raised around Ulm. He wasn't a 48er, but his family moved to the United States just before the revolutions, but his sentiments were, I would say, very similar, although maybe not quite as radical. And like I said, he was the first president, and he served basically in every leadership position at one time or another within the Cincinnati Turner Society.
And we've just seen 3 images of him: one from pre-war, one from later in the war as a senior officer, and then one from the 1880s post-war. So those 3 images that we've just shown are all of Gustav there.
So Gustav started as the first sergeant of First Company, and eventually he ended up, as you saw, as lieutenant colonel of the 106th Ohio, and he became mayor of Cincinnati at the turn of the century. And so he was a real powerful figure in the community. His younger brother.
I'm gonna say, let me just hold you there for a second. Just De Neuner specific. Is he still the first sergeant in the days that we will portray?
Yes, he is. He's the first sergeant of First Company up until I believe he gets promoted to lieutenant sometime in 62, and then right after that he's out as lieutenant colonel.
Okay, and then in our story, his younger brother?
Yep, his younger brother Hugo was a corporal, and he was said to be have a beautiful singing voice, very active within the Turner community. He unfortunately was killed at the Battle of Mill Springs in January of 62, but at the time that we'll be portraying, he is a corporal in First Company as well.
Okay.
And then another name that's really important to know with both the 9th Ohio and the Cincinnati Turn Society is Friedrich Berich. Friedrich Berich was a lieutenant in Company B, or Second Company. He was born in Stuttgart, but raised in Reutlingen, which is right in the middle of Revolution country, as we've discussed before. So his father was a lithographer, and he followed in that tradition. And so he was actually, we believe, the one that was sort of the artist of this lithograph of the Turners, both in 1858 lithograph, and then the 61 that we don't have a picture of. But he actually got interested in the Turner movement by the singing. That's one of the things that Dan mentioned that really sort of was a hallmark of the Turner Society, and that was sort of his big interest. So he moved to Louisville and then Cincinnati by 1853, and he served as the instructor of the Cincinnati Turner Society, and he also founded the first Turner Girls' School in the United States, and he helped that the Turner Society grow to a total of 385 members by 1857. So the other thing that sort of kind of brings him to life is he's one of the authors of dozens of wartime letters that were written to the Cincinnati Volksfreund, which was a German language newspaper. And they're all exhibited in a very well done book by Joseph Reinhardt called A German Hurrah. And I think we may have forgotten to provide a link for that, but we'll provide one later in the comments. And I mean, it just gives not just a good insight into daily life as a soldier or an officer, at least, but he's very opinionated, so you can kind of see sort of the inside the mind a little bit of one of our Turner officers from Second Company.
Fantastic. Well, Dan, let's hand it back to you, and let's keep going. You have some discussion, some thoughts. You started already talking about Die Turnerei, the Turner Way. would you pick up there and keep the conversation with Friedrich Hecker moving forward?
Yeah, sure. So just some other asides. Ugo Toffel, before the Civil War, had moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, and helped to found the Leavenworth Turner Society, which was involved in kind of the bloody Kansas ordeal up there. And so we have some really great letters between him and Gustav back and forth from Leavenworth to Cincinnati before the Civil War, talking about, that whole bloody Kansas ordeal, and actually mentioning the creation of the Turner lithograph that we're gonna see some excerpts of. So that's really cool. Friedrich Birch, he also founded the first art school, Turner Art School, and like Andrew said, the first Zoglingsverein, or children's society within the Turners. So the Turner Society was different than the Anglican men's organizations, which were kind of secret societies. They were closed off. The Turners Turnering was a lifestyle. So if you think of like a hockey family today, or a soccer family, or a dance family, Turner families that was their life. Turner Hall, which is the image behind Andrew that was built in 1859 in over the Rhine, that was like that was their home. They lived in these cramped, tenement houses that had no light, no ventilation. And so getting out, exercising, and going to this place where they could be around other Germans and celebrate their German heritage, that was their lifestyle. And so that was, that's what being a Turner was all about. Living the lifestyle, living a healthy lifestyle, talking about politics, not just taking sort of a backyard view of politics, but really being involved. And they brought in the Turner Hall, they brought in a lot of kind of the political refugees of the time. Certainly before the Civil War, they brought in Louis Kossuth to speak, who was a Hungarian revolutionary who was in exile in the U.S. at the time. He spoke at the Turner Hall. They brought in a German suffragist, Annette, can't think of her name. Annika.
Franziska.
Yeah, I can't think of her name now, but they brought in a German suffragist in the 1850s, which was very early in the suffragette movement. And she spoke to a largely male audience about the suffragette movement. So, these are the type of political discussions that were had at the Turner Hall before the Civil War. They were very open-minded. They were open to hearing all the issues that were happening in America at the time. And, I'm sure there were some lively debates. Most of the Turners were, like Friedrich Birch, were not afraid to speak their mind. So I'm sure those discussions would have been very interesting to be a part of.
Okay, well then, Dan, let me bring this round for just a second before you keep going, because you just answered Andy Roscoe's question in the chat about were the Turners politically active as a group. I'll also mention Andy threw a link for the German Hurrah down into the chat if anybody's looking for that book. Dovetailing and keeping going on the politics for a minute, Dan, Eric Urbanus asks, was there much of a relationship between the Turners and the nascent Republican Party, or did they try to portray themselves as above politics or apolitical?
No, I think they certainly were anti-Whig party. They were certainly the nativist party, and we'll talk about that probably a little bit later. They were very political. There was a beer hall that kind of adjoined the backside of the Turner Hall, where a lot of the Cincinnati politicians would meet, city politicians who would meet there and discuss. And there's documentation that there were boys that would run in between the beer hall and the Turner Hall and kind of relay what was being said by these politicians. There were several, political conventions that were held at the Turner Hall. I don't know that the Cincinnati Turners were necessarily more Republican than Democrat. It depends on the time period, really. But they didn't they didn't try to divorce themselves from politics. They brought in all sides and discussed openly. And I think there was less polarity certainly than there is today within their ranks in terms of political views.
Okay.
So yeah, and just to kind of wrap up on that discussion. So what were the Turners? From a philosophical. So the Turners were definitely anti-congregational, which means they didn't like anyone telling them how they should think. So how that manifested itself is that they were very anti-Catholic. So you would very rarely find a Catholic member of a Turner organization. There were some Lutherans and Reform Lutherans, but there were also sort of pre-Marxist socialists, what we call the free thinkers, and there were even people, atheists. So there was this whole range of both political and religious ideology that lived together in this Turner organization. Now, that being said, the Cincinnati Turners were considered the Mutterverein, or the Mother Society. So they took a very leadership role and a very conservative role in comparison to some of the more socialist Turnvereins like New York City and Chicago, who had labor riots later on and were very radical in their thought. The Cincinnati, as the Mother Society, really tried to keep everyone together and were more conservative and less radical than most of the other societies.
Great. Will you just wrap some of this up right now and give us a little bit of a look at Hecker, his influence even today, and then take us into Willich?
Sure. So Friedrich Hecker was born in Baden, which is in southwest Germany. So the Turner movement started at the very northeast rather of Germany, around Berlin. The Turners had moved throughout the Germanic principalities, kingdoms, down to Baden by 1848. Hecker comes from a rich family. His father was he was a court council member, and Hecker was educated in Heidelberg and Munich. He became a lawyer, and he also became a member of the liberal wing of the Baden State Assembly, and that's where he started giving these talks and being very outspoken against the Germanic nobility, and that's how he became involved in the revolution. So he in about September of 1848, he kind of flees to Switzerland after the Battle of Condern, and then comes to America, first to Cincinnati. So after 1848 and 1849, going back to Germany to try to refight the revolution that fails, he comes back and he settles in Illinois around Belleville area. He helps to form the Belleville Turners. He also leads the 24th Illinois for a little bit. They disband, and then he leads the 82nd Illinois. After the Civil War, he again settles back in Illinois, and he's really, they still laud him as this Germanic hero until his death in the 1880s. He went on a speaking tour in Germany after the formation of Germany, the country, in 1871, and he had a very even though he was considered a sort of a gentleman farmer, he had a vineyard and a farm in Illinois. He went on these speaking tours and made a lot of money speaking to German communities and Turner societies throughout the U.S. And he was very active in Illinois politics and just led a very active and engaged life. Here in Cincinnati, we built a Hecker monument. I think it was 3 years after he died in the 1880s. And that's still in a prominent space in kind of our central park of our German-American district and over the Rhine in what's called Washington Park. And so he still lives on today in memory here in Cincinnati as kind of a hero of the Germanic immigrants.
Fantastic.
And it's right next to the Robert McCook Monument.
Oh, there you
Exactly.
go. Well, we need to guys. So I put the photo up a couple of times of the of his monument. It would be great to get the McCook monument and put that up some point down the road through either THE or the Neuner event. I want to jump so we don't go too terribly long. We're 35 minutes in, everybody. Dave Wakowiak, an old reenacting buddy of mine, just chirped in and says, even though there are maybe atheists and there may be others that they, within taking you sort of into the part of the conversation he commented on, he said, but it does sound like they were spiritual, the Turners.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think atheists are non-spiritual, and they certainly weren't either. They were, very concerned about having a free mind without prejudice. And so what that meant is they didn't like a pope, they didn't like an archbishop, they didn't like anyone telling them how they should think or feel, because they all had free minds and they could make their decisions based on the facts and the trends of the times without someone telling them what they needed to do. So they wanted to educate themselves. They wanted to be in tune with what was going on politically, socially, and even spiritually in their cities. They were very active, engaged citizens.
Fantastic.
I've got a quote that I'd like to wait until we get to the very end and sort of lead us out with it, that speaks to that sort of spiritualism, and it also gives a really clear idea of sort of what Gustav Taffel's mindset was with regard to the Turners. So
great. Well, let's hold that. But as we get towards Gustav, I want to jump right in, Andrew, to you. Let's start talking about the Cincinnati Turnverein and the 9th Ohio.
Sure. So, leading up to the Civil War, they experience just tremendous growth from 14 original members. By 1850, they had reached almost 300 members, and by the outbreak of the Civil War, it was about 400. Now, Dan mentioned that they were sort of at odds with the congregation or the sort of the organization of the Catholic religion, and so there were some sort of struggles that they went through in Cincinnati in the 1850s. There was a riot in 1853 that happened in Over the Rhine, and Dan can probably provide more detail on this that directly relates to sort of the anti-native or the anti-Catholicism.
Yeah, so that was the Bedini riots, or in German they called it the Weihnachtsschlacht, because it happened in December around Christmas time, Weihnachtstime. And so Cardinal Bedini was the U.S. ambassador to the papacy, and he was coming into town to visit with the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. The German American community, mostly the free thinkers, who were probably the most radical of all the Germans, some of whom were Turners, got together and said, we're going to protest. We don't like this Bedini guy. We don't like the papacy. And we're going to have a torchlit parade to the Archbishop's house. And we're going to protest him. And they made an effigy of Cardinal Bedini and burned him along the way. And they were protesting that congregationalism. A riot broke out. The Cincinnati police stepped in, and I think a handful, 4 or so people were actually killed in that riot. But that was one of the things. And then as nativism came in, as more and more Germans came to Cincinnati, and the more Anglican or English population saw them drinking on Sundays and partying, and thought that they were not moral people because of that, there was a lot of anti-nativism. And so that sparked a riot a couple of years later in 1855 around a mayor, a Cincinnati mayoral race, and a guy by the name of James Taylor, not the musician, was running as the Nativist Party candidate, and the Nativists went into Over the Rhine and tried to destroy and steal some of the ballot boxes. Sound familiar? And that resulted in a riot in 1855, and again, several folks lost their lives in that too. So, and these anti-nativist riots happened all in cities all over the country in German American communities. There was one in Columbus. There were some in New York City, Philadelphia. So this nativist party was really caused a lot of trouble for the newly arrived German American immigrants.
Yeah.
And what I think is interesting about it is these two, the 53 and the 55 riots, have different actors. And so 53, you have the Know Nothings, and the Germans are sort of on the same side, fighting against the Catholics. But then in 55, you have the Germans and the Irish on the same side, fighting against the Know Nothings. And this is all in downtown Cincinnati.
You're saying turbulent times and strange bedfellows.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay.
And the reason that these are that we mention these is that our friends Toffel and Friedrich Berch, as well as a few others who ended up as members of the 9th Ohio, they were involved in these riots to the point where there was another one that happened in 1856, to the point where they were charged with crimes and eventually they were acquitted. But again, turbulent times and strange bedfellows.
Right. Well, let me do this. Using that and talking about our friends in the 9th Ohio, Andy Roscoe just a minute or two asked, how explicitly were the Turners tiered to the Cincinnati militia companies? Let me use that to turn our conversation from pre-war into the pre-war militia, and let's go right into Lincoln's call nationwide and in Cincinnati.
Sure. Now, I have to admit I don't know a ton about the pre-war militia companies in Ohio, but I do know that the companies that were in and around Cincinnati, there was a heavy German element, and of that German element, quite a few of those were Turners. There were also individual companies, or more likely sections or platoons, that were raised by the Turner Society. And that's one of the hallmarks of the Turner movement, is in addition to all these, the gymnastics and whatnot, they also they did military drill. And so, going into Lincoln's call, when the 9th Ohio was formed, the story is that they had this big meeting at the Turner Hall. Gustav Toffel was, in my view, probably the mover and shaker that made it all happen. And right after that, the regiment was full. The first 4 companies of the 9th Ohio were heavily populated with Turners. First company, I would say probably 80 to 90%, including all of the NCOs and all of the officers, were Turners. And that was definitely by far the heaviest population of Turners. But second, third, and fourth companies were also formed, not just from the Cincinnati Turngemeinde, but from Turner societies in Louisville, Indy, Hamilton, and then of course, Hamilton is a town, for those of you not near Cincinnati, is a city about 35 minutes north of Cincinnati, and Covington and Newport are in northern Kentucky across the river. And so all of these were sort of consolidated together into the first 4 companies. As we talked about with Villick, he raised companies 5 through 8, and then the story is that they felt that they had a full regiment, and then they realized that they needed 2 more companies, and so the 2 companies 9 and 10 were supplemented by pre-war militia. So what sort of what effect did the Turner Way have on how the 9th Ohio was organized and how they executed themselves as a regiment? When we talked about Villick, if some of you can recall the story of 2 Turners, they came late to the party, we would say, and they couldn't find a spot in the regiment, and then they approached a guy who ended up being Villick, who said, well, okay, see that fence way across the field, run and jump over the fence, jump back and come back. And, being Turners, they had no problem doing that. And so what the 9th Ohio would do, and I'm assuming some of the other Turner regiments, a lot of times they would supplement or even replace their military drill with their Turner exercises. Now, that created a lot of conflict a lot of times with their superior officers, but if you'll remember, their colonel was Robert McCook, who had connections upon connections. He personally knew the Edwin Stanton, and so they basically let him do what they want. And so we talk about the Turners being gymnastics. I'm glad that Dan gymnasts. I'm glad that Dan mentioned the parallel bars and the rings and that sort of thing, because it wasn't just calisthenics that they were doing. If you look at some of the books that were published over in Germany that talk about some of these Turner exercises, the majority of the book is what we would call, like Dan said, CrossFit. But when you get deeper into the chapters, they talk about, so the calisthenics, as we would call them, they call Freiübungen. And it's things like standing on your toes, leg lifts, knee bends. But then when they get more into it, they have Übungen am Barren, Reck, Klettergerüste. It's the parallel bar, the horizontal bar, the climbing. We would call it a jungle gym. They have instructions how to climb a wall, how to mount a horse, how to ride. Fencing, and then they even talk about, in some of the non-military books, they talk about things like throwing a ball, dancing, swimming, ice skating. So like Dan said, they take a holistic approach to physical fitness. And I'm assuming when you see these guys, the story of their first enlistment is, as they were giving the physical exercise, the doctor would tap on their chest, and it would sound like so many anvils, and their muscles were supple as antelopes, he said. And so, these guys, there's a from the lithograph, there's a photo of 2 men with a guy standing on their shoulders, and he's sort of lifting a cup. And it's those sorts of things that they were doing way before we really had any sort of organized gymnastics. Another thing that they would do is Dan talked about the Turnfests. They would do what they called a Turnfahrt, which is, we would call maybe a pleasure hike, and they would go off into the woods for a few hours in one direction, and they'd find a camping spot, they do their exercises, they might recite poetry or sing songs and drink beer, and they stay the night or don't, and then they hike back the next day. And sometimes they would have these Turnfest. And actually, the 9th Ohio, during their service, we know for sure they held at least one Turnfest, and this was in West Virginia. It would have been about a month before the time that we're going to portray at Neuner. And what they actually did is they pulled a stone out of the Potomac River. And they wrote about this in their regimental history. They sent it back to Cincinnati to have it sent to Berlin in honor of the Turnfest that they were having over in Berlin. Now, after doing some research, there is a statue dedicated, the Jan Denkmal is what it is called. It's in the Hasenheide in Berlin, and it's dedicated to Friedrich Ludwig Jahn. But when you look at the base of the monument, it is built out of all of these different stones, and on the stones you can see inscriptions, not just from the Cincinnati Turngemeinde, but there's one from, I believe, the Philadelphia Turner Society. There's one from Chicago. Kansas City is another one. So we believe that this may be, we don't know for sure, but this may be that stone from the Potomac River. Another time that we think they may have had a Turnfest is during the siege of Corinth in the spring to summer of 1862. There's a quote from an English language newspaper that a native-born officer had sort of wandered by, and he commented that not only did they sort of rig a wood turning lathe to manufacture their own chess pieces, but they had also built a Flying Dutchman and a revolving swing, as well as they were doing bag races and horse racing. So, those are sort of the things that the 9th Ohio did to not to differentiate themselves, but that they did that differentiated them from other units.
Well, how many Turners do we think are in the 9th Ohio?
The history says there were about 300, a little bit more than that. We've been able to confirm about 175, but unfortunately, the Turner records for Newport and Covington and Hamilton and the surrounding areas are not as intact as the Cincinnati is. So it's going to be difficult to give an exact number, but they claim about 300. It begs the description, the question that the 9th Ohio is described many times as a Turner regiment, and with 30% being Turners, I don't know that I would go that far. Although I would say, if they had 30% of the population of the regiment, they probably had 90% of the control of the regiment. There were a lot of Turners that were in officer positions. The other thing to keep in mind is that the 9th Ohio wasn't the only Turner regiment. There were others. I mean, if we're going to put the name Turner Regiment to the 9th Ohio that only had 300, then we also have to talk about some of the New York regiments, like the 7th, 8th, and 29th. And there were pure Turner regiments like the 20th New York, which Matthew Burzig actually runs the 20th New York research page. And he's got a lot of great information about that regiment, which served in the 6th Corps, I believe.
And Matthew has been chiming in liberally with some really cool and fun stuff throughout the chat, including the 20th New York requested Turner equipment be sent to for field training. And then he goes on to say the New York Turner Board declined that one. So, and I just, through the THE page here, I just shared a link to Matthew's page on Facebook into our chat. So we have that as well.
And they also did a lithograph of the New York Turner Rifle unit about the same time as the Cincinnati Turners did theirs. And it looks a lot like the Cincinnati Turner lithograph, and Birch may have had a hand in that as well. We don't know.
Great. Well, let me keep us going as we're 55 minutes in. Let's stay with the ninth for a little bit. We've met Birch. We've met the Teufels. Who else can we meet who are Turners? I know we've worked with this lithograph that we showed in the ad for the page, and now we're looking at some specifics. Andrew, would you briefly introduce me to some more members who we'll see?
Sure. The first one would be Albin Stecher. He's not going to be, he wasn't from one of the companies that we'll be portraying. He was actually a member of the band, and that kind of speaks to, what they're doing with the lithograph. He's holding a violin there, and as we look at some of these pictures, we'll see these folks are represented doing what they love, what everybody knew they would be associated with, or everybody who knew them would know. Another one would be Adam Schumacher. He is also a member of First Company, and he's one of the ones that's holding up Konstantin Conrad, who was not a Ninth Ohio. He was not a Niner, but he was, as he's holding this sort of victory chalice, he won second prize in gymnastics in 55 and 56, so they're very proud of that. So Adam Schumacher was in First Company as a sergeant. Eventually, he became captain of the 7th Company by 1864. He lived in Cincinnati, and obviously, or not obviously, but surprise, his occupation was a shoemaker. The other guy is Ferdinand Müller. His on the list on the bottom of the lithograph, he's just known as Captain Müller, and so we know that he was the captain of the Turner Society sort of rifle company, and he was also captain of 2nd Company in the 9th Ohio. And he is the ancestor of one of our members, Mark Regensburg. So it was a really interesting connection to discover.
Wow, that's fun. Well, let's do this. Let's talk a little bit more about this lithograph. Let's go some more into the details. The Turnleben in Cincinnati. Dan, if you would take us through this, and then as we have only a few minutes left, let's briefly talk about what else we can see in here.
Yeah, so like Andrew said, each of these little vignettes kind of speaks to all the aspects of the Turner Society. There are musicians, there are guys that were brewers that are pouring from kegs, there are guys holding wine glasses, there were vineyardists and winemakers within the ranks. There's an interesting image of a guy that has a sword that has crocodile engraved on it. If you look very closely, and so there's some very personal specifics included in these drawings, and that's kind of what we think Birch gave to this lithograph. So you can really dig into this lithograph and learn a lot of personal things about each of the members. There's a key at the bottom. The reason we know who's in it is there's a key, and each of these figures are numbered, so we know exactly who each of these people are. And so, you can act as a genealogist and kind of dig into their lives and figure out what they did. But the clues are in what they're doing in that lithograph. And this is a really cool historical asset that we have for both the 9th and the Cincinnati German community.
Great. And I know, Andrew, you helped prepare the raw graphics that I've rendered out for this. You picked some specific stuff. Why don't you go ahead and walk us through what you picked here?
Sure. The first thing I want to look at is the Turner flag. Dan already spoke about the 4 Fs. And you can see that displayed prominently on the flag. The oak leaves are a common symbol of the Turners. In fact, on some of the pictures that you'll find at the 20th New York site, same thing. A lot of the oak leaves. There are a lot of musicians, as we mentioned, not just Stecher, but there's a guy playing a zither, I think. There's a guy playing a guitar. There are some guys holding swords up in the sort of the top row. And, we found both of those guys. The guy on the left is Leonhard Schreiber. He won first prize at most of the fencing competitions in Cincinnati. The other guy served in a militia unit in the Civil War as well.
So, Andrew, just a quick note about Schreiber. All of the cast iron storefronts in Over the Rhine, the majority of them were made by Schreiber and Company. So he was an iron worker. And that's how he got into making fencing swords and becoming a good fencer. That was his profession. So if you walk through down Vine Street or Main Street and Over the Rhine, you'll see all these Italianate buildings built from the 1850s through the 1890s, and those are his cast iron storefronts that he made in his business.
Wow!
And some of that iron work was shipped as far south as New Orleans. So the French Quarter still has some of his iron fretworks in the balconies that are important during Mardi Gras.
Keep people up off the road. Well, Andrew, what we won't see in Mardi Gras necessarily is family. Do we see it here?
Yeah, I mean, like Dan said, that was a great description of a hockey family or a soccer family. Like there are photos, representations of there's a dad with his son. There's even a sort of a young, he looks maybe 8 or 9 years old. So yeah, I mean it's definitely represented that it's sort of fun for the whole family. And then the last thing is they even took great pains to, if you look at the skyline, this lithograph is taken drawn from the perspective of northern Kentucky looking across the Ohio River at the Cincinnati skyline. And so if you look at some of the spires of these churches and everything, and the way the streets are laid out, you can sort of see that, okay, well, that's St. Paul's, and that's if you know what to look for. And one of the ways that you can sort of explore the Cincinnati skyline from this period, or close to it anyway, is a while back. The Cincinnati Library here, they did a panorama of a photo that was taken in 1848. There should be the link down in the comments at some point. And it was taken from basically the same perspective, somewhere on the northern Kentucky side of the river. And as we know about photos back then, they have great resolution. And so if you zoom in on some of these points, the library has done a great job of labeling some of the points. But if you zoom in, you can see some of the same, what appears to be the same church spires. So it's just really neat to be able to compare these two.
That's very cool. And we've looked at the top of the Turner lithograph was split up left, right, and center. And I walked you from left to right across the back of that first, and then we saw the panorama. So, well, gents, we've been going a little bit over an hour, and I want to say thanks to both Andrew and Dan for coming with us, and for everyone who's checked in, and the 13 who are still here for the comments. Thanks for engaging in history. At Neuner, we will see a small slice of what was the 9th Ohio through these live streams, and Andrew is one of the driving forces behind it. We just have to say, Absolute huge thank you for keep bringing the history out, allowing us to use this event that many of us are going to go to as a chance to connect a little bit more to history and to learn a broader range. Matthew, I've seen you chirping in. He shouts out a thank you here, but Matthew, thank you to you for what you're doing there and for everybody signing in. Dan, I know you did a lot to help prepare for this, and thank you for joining us and bringing your expertise. I'm actually, having produced 2 videos in the last year on hardtack, I'm now looking forward to go back and read the blog post that you did there. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Andrew, Dan, any last things from you guys before we sign off? Well,
I just wanted to add, if you look at the lithograph and really take a long, hard look at it, it speaks to these were real people. They had hobbies, they had lives, and this is just a really good connection to it.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I continue to think that this is one of the coolest organizations in the U.S., the Turner Societies, and we can certainly learn a lot about where we've come today from the Turners.
Absolutely. Well, if you want to learn more about the Turners, I'm going to do the plug that Dan won't do. Pick up a copy of his book. You can find a link earlier on. Hope you guys enjoy it. We will let you know when there's another live stream coming from THE, and look for more posts about German history in the 9th Ohio as we get ready for Neuner. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the time. Have a great evening.